button. And without further ado, I think we can start. So welcome everyone. It's very exciting to be here today with you. I'm going to share my screen. I don't have too big of a presentation, but I just wanted to make sure we had a visual support to discuss. So welcome to this Brain Communications Review Academy introductory workshop. I am David Bellin. I'm a professor of behavioral neuroscience at the University of Cambridge, and I am one of the associate editors of Brain Communications. I have the real pleasure to be working with our editor-in-chief, Professor Tara Spiers-Jones. So before we discuss the notion of peer review, we thought it was very important that you guys had a better understanding of the ethos of brain communications. And actually what we want to promote is solid research. And what solid research is not so much whether you use the latest super hot technology, is whether, you have a sound hypothesis that is well justified and contextualized. So in other words, that there's a scholarly account of the context within which this research is carried out, that the experiments are well designed with appropriate statistical design, and that the research is well conducted. All of that eventually leading to a single conclusion supported by the results. And at Brain Communications, novelty is not a criterion, nor how hot the methods used in the study are, leading to an editorial decision. So is everyone familiar with this kind of approach to publication? Which to some extent, and I can tell you because I've been through that 3 times over the past 2 years, is quite orthogonal to that of some magazines, such as Science or Nature. So once we've got a good idea as to what Brain Communications considers as a mission, as a scientific journal, which is to support and help disseminate solid research and solid science, we can discuss the peer review process. And when at one of our editorial board meetings, the notion of a training program for young scientists was discussed, it became apparent that many PhD students, many young postdocs, while they are trained to write papers, they're not necessarily trained to review papers. And as a matter of fact, you can't simply decide to be a good reviewer if you don't have any training. And that is part, we believe, of the various duties and skills one scientist should be acquiring in the early days of their career. So what we're going to do today is to try to be very interactive in the way we discuss about the various questions I've laid out for you, such as why would we engage in peer review? That's the first question one may ask. It's a time-consuming process, so why would you do that? And if we do this, what is the purpose of a peer review? Then we'll discuss how should we engage in the review of a manuscript, and how should we write a constructive review. So may I ask one of you your view as to why we should engage in peer review? Please don't be shy. The advantage is that there's no bad answer. So.
Okay. Hi.
Hi, Rachel. Yes.
Yeah. So my name is Shivangi. Yeah. So I think we should engage in peer review process to serve the community out there in science, so as to maintain the rigorous process of like submitting the manuscript, how valid the experiment, the genuinity of the process, to maintain the genuinity of the process, I believe.
Yeah, so that's a very, very good reason. Rachel, you were about to say something as well?
Well, I was going to say at the most basic level, it helps us just improve the quality of a manuscript.
Yes, absolutely. Another idea as to why we should do it? So as a matter of fact, there are some altruistic reasons why we should engage in peer review, and some others that are perhaps more selfish. Don't you think that, as you've discussed, actually peer review is, as of today, a key process in the publication of your results, of your own results? And actually you would expect peers to review your work, and it's a duty of reciprocity as an author, and more generally, a duty to contribution to the field to peer review in a general context. But I thought there were other kind of far-reaching implications in being an active peer reviewer. First, you may actually become involved in shaping your field, right? Or at least you may develop the feeling that you are exposed to very early on to science that is yet to be published, and that may well also help you shape your own ideas. But I find it myself a very important personal experience in that for each paper I review, I learn a lot. So, it's not just altruistic. I really do learn a lot for the papers I review. As a matter of fact, surprisingly so, since I've become a PI, and I'm ashamed to say so, but I don't really have time to read that much. But every single time I press yes, I agree to review a paper, and I try to do that once a week, I know that I've set expectations and I've got that commitment that will force me to read a paper in depth. And you all know that you would read papers in order to have a feel for where the field is going, but you never really spend much time getting into the nitty-gritty of the methods of the paper or to criticize it in depth. To commit to peer review is a commitment to actually doing this. And I find the peer review process, at least personally, something that helps me learn a lot. You also learn from what the other reviewers write, and you often, if not always, learn from the response from the authors. So to some extent, to me, it's a very important personal experience, and it's part of my learning journey in science. Does anybody have a point? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think there's more? There's less? Had you considered the selfish nature of peer review as well? Well, I'm going to say something that is not politically correct, but many reviewers consider the selfish nature of peer review as a way to make sure that they trash the work of their competitors, and so that theirs can move on. That is not the right selfish nature of peer review, not what it should be. So we should engage in peer review because it's part of the activity of scientists to disseminate their work. And as of now, we could be spending 3 hours discussing the extent to which peer review is a valid process or not. But as of now, it is the process. And we can, if we are an active peer reviewer, also deal with some issues that have led so many scientists to criticize it, which is bias, inappropriate reviews, the kind of things I guess, almost each one of you have already experienced, or unfortunately may well experience in the future with regards to peer review. So at Brain Communications, we make sure at the editorial level that the reviewers with whom we work are scientists we trust, scientists who engage in the peer review process in a constructive way for the right reasons, and scientists who respect the authors. So mutual respect is something that is core to what a peer review should be. And actually you cannot expect mutual respect if the individual doesn't engage in the peer review process for the right reasons. Yeah? So having discussed this, Then what is the purpose of a peer review? So Shivangi, you told us, well, it's to provide guarantee that the science is good. What are the actually overall purposes you think of a peer review? Why would I spend time reviewing for a journal and not another one? What is your job as a reviewer?
Hi, I'm Shinjini. I guess to make sure that the conclusions that are drawn are valid from the results that are being presented.
That's absolutely one of the key objectives of a peer review. That's one of the criteria you're going to use to make your recommendation to the editor, right? So that is a very important point. It may well be the most important point of the exercise of peer reviewing, but perhaps the purpose of the review is to help the authors publish as good as possible a piece of science. And actually, I consider the peer review process as a partnership between the editors of the journal, the authors, and myself. The purpose should not be to simply police the science. It should be to provide a constructive intellectual input, which helps, to the best of your own knowledge, added to that of the authors, shape the paper in a way that both the journal and the authors benefit from it. The journal keeps publishing the best science there is, and the authors have had a little push, if needs be. Sometimes they don't need anything, a little push that just makes the paper better. And I would say that should be the purpose of our work as a peer reviewer. Because honestly, anyone can trash any paper. I could trash all of my papers in 10 seconds each. And scientists who say, oh, my papers are rock solid, I'm not sure they're being very honest with themselves. So trashing a paper, it's very easy. And as a matter of fact, young reviewers, and I've seen that in my lab and in that of many colleagues around me, and PhD students or postdocs want to demonstrate their critical thinking skills to their PIs when they are tasked with reviewing a paper by systematically trashing a paper. Look, all the issues I found. Well, that is, of course, a first aspect, identify issues. But real constructive intellectual input should provide avenues for the authors to consider in order to improve the paper. And that is the very difficult part of the job. Don't you think? So by definition, that is supposed to be a workshop, guys. So please just interact, stop me, disagree, agree, just so that we're on the same page. So I would say that the purpose of a peer review, first and foremost, is to help the authors achieve the best possible manuscript. We're not here to prevent them from publishing. We're here to make sure that with our knowledge added to theirs and our critical assessment of their work, we provide enough guidance such that they can make it better. And that helps the journal publish high quality science. Once again, one should not be seduced by shiny techniques and super hot contemporary approaches, because often that is not guarantee of quality whatsoever. And a consequence of actually peer reviewing is that when you start identifying patterns of issues in papers you review, you will make sure that when you write your own papers, you will be avoiding these issues straight away. So again, it's part of the learning experience. You improve your own writing skills when you peer review. And if not your own writing skills, you also improve the ability with which you're going to engage in the peer review as an author. Writing a rebuttal letter is as tricky business as writing a constructive review. And the more exposed we are to rebuttal letters and the way authors have addressed points we've made, the easier it will be for us later on to do the same exercise as an author. So there's always something to gain. But if I may say so, peer reviewing a paper is not about trashing that paper. Trashing is easy. Constructive input is difficult. So then you may tell me, and this is something that I find it difficult to gauge myself. If I peer review a paper and I end up providing 3 experiments that are necessary for the authors to support their claims, should I feel entitled to share the authorship? Because now my intellectual contribution is such that without it, the paper should not exist. And I have a rule in my lab, and it's part of the contract of anyone who comes to my lab. If it ever happens that a reviewer tells us you need that group in order to support your conclusions, I would necessarily inquire towards the editor if that reviewer would be willing to become an author. Because I would contribute that their intellectual input is as important as ours in shaping that paper. And so the way I deal it with it myself, I'm not saying it is the way to do, and I'm looking forward to listening to you guys, is when it is the case, and it is not that often the case. First of all, I only ask the questions, I phrase my review, and I interact with the authors, asking questions, not offering the designs or what the experiments should be. And this is often where I draw the line between major revision or rejection. In my career, I haven't reviewed these many papers, but I guess 120 or 140 papers. I may have issued rejection 3 times, and each time it was because of something like this. What do you think? Gerardo, if I may ask you, what do you think?
Yes, I haven't considered the authorship situation before, but it is true. Everything that you reason through in this partnership with the authors, you already becoming part of the study in a sense. So it's something I've never discussed before. And
and to some extent, the policy of many journals now to publish the reviews alongside the paper gives the reviewers credit back to that extent. But I think one line needs to be drawn as to the extent to which your intellectual input is absolutely necessary for the paper to exist. Because what we do not want as constructive reviewers who fully give our time is to provide an environment in which authors who did not necessarily think their experiment through properly publish, rely on your feedback to then actually end up after a couple of rounds of reviews with an ideal design that is necessarily not exactly theirs intellectually. Mm-hmm. So a line has to be drawn there, but I guess we all get a feel for what that line is, and often the papers are not that flawed. And if they are that flawed, it may also be the case that the editors did not necessarily perform the right control quality check of the papers before sending them for review. And you should always feel free as a reviewer to interact with editors. Tell them how you feel about the amount of intellectual input that would be necessary to be provided for that manuscript to reach a standard of publication, and then say, well, according to me, that is, this is crossing the line to being part of claiming authorship. Is that something alien to most of you, or does it make sense? I see Rachel do that.
Is it,
Like-
I'm sorry, Rachel, go on.
No, I was just going to agree. I mean, I think if you're crossing the line into a zone that feels like authorship, you're spending probably more time reviewing the paper than maybe you should even.
Absolutely.
And that's a good line in the sand to draw, and not something I had considered either.
Absolutely. Maura, you want to say something?
Yeah, it's something like actually that is a bit new to me. So I wanted just to ask you for, like, from your experience, if this happened to you in the reverse situation, like that you were a reviewer and you were included as author, or as editor, you suggested to the authors to include the reviewer.
So actually, it's never happened to me. I've been exposed to situations where the extent of the comments I made were such that my review was 5 pages long. And having written the review, I realized, wow, that's as long as the paper almost. And I realized that actually, because I tried to be constructive, the experiments I suggested, which were key to supporting the interpretations and the conclusions, amounted to perhaps the intellectual work that had been initially put in designing that experiment. And of course, in that case, you write to the editor and say, well, this is where I stand. This is my review. I'm not submitting this review through the portal yet. This is what I've done. And I have the feeling that, this is far too much to ask the authors, because, you're asking to do everything again. And if that's okay with you, I'd rather write a shorter review with questions. So less constructive in a sense, but pointing towards issues with questions. And my recommendation to you will be to reject, because as a matter of fact, it's not a revision. It will be a brand new paper. So this is where I draw the line between major revisions, which is almost always what I would recommend to the editor, and rejection.
Interesting. Thanks. This is very helpful.
And as a PI, one never knows, but we do review our papers internally, and we try to trash them and kill them as much as possible internally before we submit them for publication. And if one day it happens that indeed I realize that one of the reviewers points to a group that is key to supporting our conclusions, I will definitely ask the editor to invite the reviewer to be an author. That's a commitment we have. It's part of our publication policy in my lab.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah, because there are also journals on this point. There are also journals that suggest, encourage to not write too long reviews. So it's like always, oh, I have more points, but it should not be longer than what they suggest. So, well,
I think then it very much depends. Shiniji, I've seen that you raise your hand. I'll come to you in a second. It very much depends. My Publon profile is available, and by no means do I mean that you should be looking up to my profile, but my stats are that my reviews are far longer than that of the average of my field. And it is often because instead of phrasing my issues as questions, I phrase them as questions with a suggested response to the question, pointing the authors towards perhaps you may want to consider it that way, and that may well be the additional experiment you may do. And often they don't need to do additional experiments. Often is that their statistical design was flawed, and some of the conclusions they had, for instance, relied on interactions effects in ANOVAs instead of sepal effects, and they hadn't reported the interaction. So in that case, I would suggest, you should do the analysis like this, and I would suggest the outcome. And of course, that takes much more space than just say, the analyses are wrong. Right? So it very much depends the reason why your review is longer.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mara.
It makes sense. Thanks.
Shiniji, did you want to? It's your turn.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
So I was just gonna say that I think it's a really nice thought in principle. Oh well, it is a very interesting thought. But also then, if this becomes the norm, it can be abused very easily, no? In terms of people wanting to, like, you know, making authorship a bit, yeah, dicier.
That is a very good point. Well, yes, there would be always, you know, ill-intended individuals. But if a reviewer says, actually, you know, without that particular control group, the conclusion you're drawing here, which is that on which your paper relies, is not valid, then without that editorial input, there's no paper. Perhaps you will encourage the authors to make sure that they've thought twice about their designs before they submit. But I agree with you that it could encourage some form of abuse, which I naively didn't think about before. That's a very good point. But then once again, you know, we should rely on a conversation, I would say, between the reviewer, the author, and the editor. And the editor should be able to appreciate, because they have experience with receiving so many reviews, whether such comment and such suggestion is worthy of such a claim. And I guess this should be handled by the editor. Yes, by the editor. That's a very good point I didn't think about. So, okay.
Yes. I just have a general question in terms of I know here is that we want to achieve the best possible manuscript, but also I feel like we also have to you know, have this critics that fits the scope of the journal. Like, you know, a journal immunology probably shouldn't have the same requirement as, you know, journal experimental medicine. But, you know, as a young investigator, when we first write our review comments, I feel like it's very hard to draw the line there. I just want to know your comments on that.
So if I well understood your point, and I apologize if that is not the case, you were wondering the extent to which you should tailor your criticisms to the policy and the ethos of the journal.
Yeah, I just don't know if you know, sometimes I have this questions or suggestions, but I don't know if I'm asking too much, you know.
So once again, you need to bear in mind that the only thing you do as a reviewer is to help the editor make a educated decision. And if editors ask reviewers for their help, it's because often, you know, an editor has a particular set of skills and knowledge, and many of the papers we receive actually go far beyond that. So we need experts to help us make these decisions. But the decision lies with the editor. And if you end up with, you know, being sent a paper from, you know, the editor of a journal, and the quality of the paper clearly is completely outside the range of quality you would expect in that journal, that the first thing you should do before you accept to review this paper, you should go back to the editor and say, well, I've just had a look at the abstract, and it looks completely off topic to me, off scope. Are you sure? You know, this is a paper you want me to review?
See.
So it's true that the way the system works, you know, with emails, you receive these automatic emails, and you with the links, and you accept or you decline and everything, and it looks very much non-humane because it's everything through, you know, the interface. But editors are very happy to have reviewers, potential reviewers, interacting directly with them and raise issues straight away. You know, it's happened to me as an editor, not for this journal, for another journal, that I invited a potential reviewer who wrote back and said, well, I will not be reviewing this paper because I am aware that one of the authors has set up a company that produces one of the drugs used in the paper, but it's not acknowledged there. And, you know, as an editor, this is information you want to know, of course. So once again, a key point in all that process is that of communication. Openness, communication, you know, reviewers should feel free to inquire to their editors whether a point is worth making or not. Right. So If you are not quite sure, the take-home message here is get back to the editor.
Okay, thank you.
Marianne.
Yeah, hi. I just have a quick question. I was still thinking about, this idea of reviewers becoming authors in specific papers. And one thing that I'm wondering about is, let's say a reviewer believes that the paper needs significant changes to be made, but then, it changes like the whole general idea of the paper or something like that. I'm just wondering if, like, one of the limitations of doing that
That is a
would be that they lose kind of, the authors kind of lose their intellectual independence in terms of the conclusions or the general goal of the paper. And so this is just something I was thinking about, and I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on the.
This is a very good point, and as a matter of fact, you've just introduced another aspect I wanted to discuss, which is how we should engage in the review process. So I'm here providing you the actually one answer to that question, is that as a reviewer, your job, and that is very difficult, is to put yourself in the shoes of the authors, is to adopt their perspective, and is to determine whether from their perspective, with your knowledge and your skills, there's anything that needs improving in this manuscript. My personal history as a PI, I don't have these many papers, but 75% of the reviews I have are reviewers who ask something that has nothing to do with what I've done. Oh, why don't they look at that? Well, I'm not looking at that because I don't care, because my study was about this. So many reviewers would actually bring your science as an author into their realm and ask you to adapt to their views of the world. Right? That's not what a constructive review is about. And this is why writing constructive review is complicated and difficult, because you need to apprehend the problem from the view of the authors. If you receive a paper from a lab that does neuropharmacology, and you are an electrophysiologist, what you'll be thinking is, well, they haven't done any electrophysiology. Or you would have criticisms that are framed by your expertise and your skills, right? What we have to do, which is the most difficult part of it all, is to put yourself in their shoes. So if we do it well, then you realize that this idea of the boundary between what's core to the paper and, as a reviewer, identifying a missing control is nothing at all to do with adding experiments. Right? So I fully agree with you. Coming back to this notion, I can't see everyone, so I want to make sure that all those who've raised their hands have had the opportunity to speak. Yes, I hope so. So you're absolutely right, Marianne. Once again, this notion of the boundaries, I was sharing with you my own personal view. I am not saying that should be a rule as claiming authorship or offering authorship to a reviewer. That is a rule we've adopted in my lab to show openness. And it is also in line with the view that when we engage in a peer review process as an author, but as a peer reviewer, actually we accept to engage in the conversation. We accept to engage in the conversation with the authors and the editor. And you would say, well, a conversation from a guy who's not a native English speaker, that may be chosen lightly. As a matter of fact, it's not. It means that when I commit to review a paper, I commit to review the paper, its revision, and if needs be, the second revision. That's the extent of the conversation. You should be there to accompany the process of maturation of the paper until publication or not. But there's no point exerting control upon first submission, and then we completely letting down the authors. Because if you do not review the revision, then it's going to be somebody else who has not yet had time to take part in that conversation, and they will have their own narrative. And that's not fair, because it means that this paper will not have been reviewed by now 2 or 3, it would be a 4th reviewer. Does it make sense? So we accept to engage in the conversation. And from that point of view, then as an author and a reviewer, we know that there will be exchange. Yes? And as a reviewer, we also need to be prepared and to be upfront about the fact that we may have been wrong. We may have misunderstood something. So if we've misunderstood it, perhaps it was poorly phrased. Perhaps we simply misunderstood it. Perhaps one group we claim is necessary is not. If we claim it's necessary and it's not, it's because in the experimental design these authors had, there was perhaps a statistical test that could control for a confounding factor, and we didn't spot it, right? If they come back to us, say, well, as a matter of fact, that's a fair point, but that is not necessary because we've done that, then you just write in your comment to their revision, I'm sorry, the authors are right, and I'm sorry. That has happened to me. To acknowledge that I was wrong. And it didn't really matter to me because I was wrong having issued a major revision, which gave the authors the opportunity to respond, not having issued a rejection when you kill the entire conversation from the onset. So yes, we may be wrong, and the authors may have been wrong. The fact that playing that game is a team game. But we need to apprehend it, I think, humbly and be willing to learn from either side. And I guess if that process is carried out properly with respect and professionally, if really there is an intellectual input that is obvious to everyone, that was key and core for that paper to exist, then everybody knows. Nyan, you've got a question.
Yes, that's a really interesting idea. I just have 2 questions on the back of that. I'm just wondering, in terms of you having to adopt the author's perspective, obviously you have to give constructive criticism. And if you wouldn't have done something a certain way, what if it's just, there is just a better way to do it? And you have to kind of find the balance of, okay, here's a better way to do it, and it's easy for them to do it this way instead of the way that they've done it. For example, using a better marker in a stain or something like that. Is that reasonable then to ask?
So yes, absolutely. So when you say better, is it because it has been clearly established that the one they use yields non-specific signal? Or is it because the field has now adopted this new one and that's the trendy one? Because in that case, it's not that one is better than the other, it's that there should be only one to be used, the one that doesn't yield unspecific signal. If it's a matter of 10% increase signal intensity between 2 markers, well, I myself, I don't care, right? So I think it depends on what you mean by better. If, of course, they use a approach, let's say someone uses microdialysis to measure sub-second scale events, yes, there are better techniques now. And actually, it's not that there are better techniques, it's that microdialysis will never give you actually such temporal resolution, and that's it. So it's not even a question of better techniques. But I think, of course, the technology is evolving so fast that tools within 3 months can change. But we also, from the author's perspective, I think, I don't know where things work in the countries in which you do research, guys, but in the UK, for instance, right now, if you ask for a you apply for the Medical Research Council and you ask for specific equipment because you're running whatever, and you realize that 6 months after you've submitted your application, so even before you receive notification whether you're funded or not, the field has moved forward and there's a better equipment. By law, I have to buy the equipment I put on my grant. By law. So what do? Nothing, or do I do with what I have? And is what I have good enough to do what I do? Yes, it was, because if I'm funded, actually the reviewers of my grant would have considered that my experimental approach was in par with the nature of my hypothesis, and that my design was sufficient to actually bring conclusions that would be robust. So of course the field would have moved forward, but everything we review now may have started 5 years ago, 6 years ago. So from the author's perspective, if we realize that they have hundreds of animals and they're doing this and this and that, you realize that they haven't done that just right now. So bringing things into context is quite important as well. But what you can always suggest is that they acknowledge that perhaps with the use of a more contemporary tool, some of the results they've had may well have been slightly different, but you could also suggest the kind of difference. If it's a quantitative difference, is the difference sufficient enough that a non-signal would have become a signal? Or is it just that the signal-noise ratio they have would have been better? Well, if the signal-noise ratio they have would have been better and they have positive results with what they have, it means that the only thing you would have changed is the effect size. You would have changed nothing else with regards to the probability of getting the same results using the same approach or a better one. And that is how I would gauge the better.
That's really helpful. Thanks. I just have one more question, which was, you kind of give the example of, if I'm an electrophysiologist, I'm going to ask for electrophysiology experiments in a paper that not necessarily in my field. Is there a line there in terms of you accepting to review a paper that you might not be as well placed to review?
Absolutely. Where is it? I don't have it here. Well, it's happened many, many times to a lot of my colleagues and myself that I receive a paper with 20 different techniques. Have you seen papers in Science and Nature and Neuron? No one can reproduce a single paper like that, not a single lab. It's just, so I would always state, well, my expertise lies there and there and there, and I can provide actually recommendation with regards to these aspects. But there are some aspects of that study that I'm not an expert of. So my recommendation would be particularly there. And once again, I engage in the conversation with the editor. My job is to help the authors and also help the editor make an educated decision. If they do not know that my expertise is narrower than the extent of techniques covered in the paper, they will take me for face value. They would suggest my recommendation covers everything. So once again, no, I would say, well, I'm a behavioral neuroscientist. This microarray stuff, I can't speak to the technology used and the method. And now the editor knows that if they did not invite an expert in that particular area as another reviewer, they have a gap in the expertise they receive and on which they will base their recommendation. So they'll invite someone who will cover that particular area. So once again, we are not subjected to a peer review process that is static. We should become actors of the process and make it very dynamic. And editors gladly receive, this kind of feedback from their reviewers. And it increases also the confidence the editors have in their reviewers. Because when you acknowledge your limitations, the extent to which you can provide recommendations there, they trust you.
Cool. Thank you so much. That was really helpful.
Zarki, you still have your hand raised. Is it because you have another question? I guess not. So coming back to this slide. So yeah, how should we engage? So we've discussed why. What is the purpose of the review? Oh, Maura, sorry, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, sorry, just a quick question, like more like probably a personal opinion. Like if you spend so much time on reviewing a paper and then the editor decided to reject, and you receive an invite from another journal for the same paper, and you notice that the authors didn't change absolutely nothing, what do you do in general, or what do you suggest to do? Because of course, like maybe you'd like to be engaged in this discussion, but maybe the authors are not.
So there are two scenarios there, and I've been exposed to both. One is a paper I reviewed for a journal where I had 18 points in my review. I remember that because I had 18 points. 3 were major points and 15 were serious minor points, points that had to be addressed. And then another reviewer had 1 point. Okay, and they suggested the paper be rejected. Whereas in my review, I stated, and I wrote to this is a very promising study, very important, provided the authors can address that. And I didn't require more experiments. It would be a very, very important paper. The paper is rejected straight away. And then I received the same paper from another journal, and I write again to the editor and said, well, I've already reviewed it, and the authors had not been given actually the opportunity to address my comments. I would gladly actually offer them this opportunity this time, even though they had resubmitted it straight away, because I guess they were frustrated with a straight rejection. And I just told the editor, I'm going to post the exact same review I've posted, but I would like to emphasize that it is important this paper is considered for publication. And it was published eventually in that journal. And the authors had engaged in the review very well, and they addressed all the points. Now, it's also happened to me that I would have major points, and these points were very serious, and other reviewers had major points that were very serious. So I learned from the other reviewers, and they spotted things I hadn't. And the authors, I received this paper again, and the authors having completely ignored everything. And I would write then to the editor and say, well, I already reviewed that paper alongside others, and the comments that were made were substantial. And I see in this submission that nothing has been done. So once again, interact with them. Just tell them. And as an editor, it's happened to me at Braincoms. It has not yet happened to me, but for other journals, it's happened to me that I receive a paper through the transfer process with a rebuttal letter, the authors having addressed the various points raised by all the reviewers in the previous journal, and I accept it straight away without resubmitting for review, because the case made by the authors was strong enough.
Yeah.
So there are, once again, there's no one fit for all solution there, but it relies on communication.
Okay, thanks.
So we've discussed the fact that we need to adopt the author's perspective. And to be honest, I find it the most difficult part of the work, because we have our own way of thinking. We have idiosyncrasies. We have habits in the way we deploy our skills, in the way we think and design experiments. And we need to appreciate that the authors don't have these skills. And I'm not saying they have worse or better skills, they just have different approaches. That's what makes science exciting. And this is where we must show plasticity and flexibility. And from their point of view, is there anything that could have been done better? And it is the better we've discussed, not just they could have used the last fluorescent probe or the last antibody. So we've discussed the fact that we may be wrong, and by reviewing, we're exposing ourselves and we're exposing our limitations. And we simply should be very upfront about this. And if it is the case that the authors demonstrate that we were wrong, We shouldn't be offended. We should be happy that we've been engaged in that system, in that process, and we should acknowledge to the authors that we were wrong. So one thing that is very important is we should engage in peer review with empathy. And because one needs to understand that as a reviewer for a paper, and even more so for a grant, we have power. Sometimes we can influence the career of a young researcher, right? If a PhD student needs that first author paper for a postdoc funding, we can influence this particular aspect of their career. So with power, we have responsibilities. And we must make sure that we will not do to someone else what we don't want to be done to ourselves. And this is where the more we review, the more the issues we find in the field will become marginal. Because if we engage in constructive review, the papers we actually constructively review will not be treated like this. So we can change it from the inside. That's one of the reasons why I spend a lot of time reviewing. So if I may, we've discussed many times over the notion of a lot of time reviewing. Guys, how long do you think you should be spending reviewing a paper? Junhua. I may have mispronounced your name. Junhua? Ding? You are muted if you are. I've tried to unmute you.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, my question is like, how careful should I look at the paper? Because if I look at every word, sometimes I may need 1 week to do that. But I think maybe waste a lot of time. So I just wonder, I maybe use 1 or 2 days or 1 week or several weeks to do that.
Thank you very much for sharing your view. And I was hoping that we would come down to that. I think, like everything else, the very first time you're going to run through the exercise, you're going to spend, yes, a day. But I would suggest that peer review should not interfere with your other duties as a scientist, and especially as a PhD student or a postdoc, you've got a lot on your plate already. So, having engaged in the Brain Communications Academy, I hope, and you should aim for, that by the 5th review, you do not spend more than 2 hours on a paper. So that means that a good reviewer is someone who knows by heart the anatomy of a paper. And the way I would myself do is take the manuscript. I always forget the abstract. I go straight to the introduction. And I look at the first sentence or couple of sentences because I know this is the world. Then the next sentences are going to introduce the key players in the game. So this is the author's world. And then there will be a however or similar word, right? And following the however, there will be, and here we've tested this. And this is where I appreciate the scholarly nature of the manuscript, whether the hypothesis is well supported and what the authors want to do. From there, I often go directly to the first paragraph of the discussion, which is the summary of the key results. And from there, I come back to the figures. I never read the figure legends. I look at the data. If there is anything in what I see that doesn't really make sense, I go to the results or the methods. But I always make my own opinion of what this figure shows. A figure is there to provide enough data that supports a single take-home message. And often a paper is the sum of these take-home messages, or one key result, and then all the confounding factors that have been controlled for to support the fact that this key result, my interpretation of it is that one. And once I've done that, then I come back and I appreciate the extent to which my understanding and interpretation of the data matches that of the authors. That takes me 15 minutes. Once this is done, then I read the paper thoroughly. And what I do is I write my review while I read. So if there's a missing reference in the introduction, I would write it. And I don't necessarily type detailed sentences. I just said, this missing. Because then, once I'm done, I play around with the right things I typed, and I cluster, and that was the next slide. How should we write it? I cluster or synthesize all the points I consider to be crucial in supporting the recommendation I'm going to make to the editor there. And then I've got often a linear assessment of the paper. So my points will be first introduction, then methods, then results, then discussion. And once you appreciate the landscape of the physical structure of a paper with paragraphs in the introduction, which are the background, paragraphs that introduce what is core to the study, the however, this in order to, or here we, all these tiny words, I just put them straight away, and they're obvious because they're just there in the physical structure of the paper. The first feel you get is the scholarliness of the paper and the extent to which the hypothesis is well supported, makes sense, and a brief sense for the data and the conclusions. So I never let the authors convince me that they're right. I just take the data as they are, make up my mind, and then I see whether the authors sold their story well, and whether what they sold is what I saw. And if it's not what I saw, then my question is, am I wrong in the way I understood it? Or is it the fact that there is something missing in the data sets, such that the conclusion drawn by the authors is not necessarily that the data show or the data support? That's how I do it. And if you, once again, when I told you it's a skill to get, you don't get to that stage in 2 reviews, but to some extent, the very first paper I wrote during my postdoc, which is when I really learned to speak English, I have 11 drafts of it. And I've had the privilege to learn from what I think is the greatest scientist in the world, Barry Everett. And I have kept these 11 drafts, and they're in my PhD students' room, because when I go through the same process, I realize that you can't you can't improvise being a good writer straight away. It's the same thing for peer review. It's just a skill. So if for your first one you've spent 1 day, that's fair enough. I would recommend that the second one, you shouldn't spend more than 4 hours. And then you should try to perform your review within 2-3 hours.
Thank you, David. I think that's very helpful. So it means that we can just catch a big idea and overlook all some details, like some word things.
Well, there are different levels of reading of a manuscript, right? And you experience that every day. When you are looking for conclusions that would support yours, you would not look at the introduction of these papers, you look at the data and the discussion. When you're looking for methods, you would focus on methods, and you don't really care about the discussion unless it's a methodological paper. Of course, the discussion is part of it. With the peer review, you need to read the paper from each level of integration, from the big ideas, the concepts, whether it's scholarly or not, to the extent to which the methods are devoid of caveats or confounding factors, if the nature of the data shows that the research was well conducted. If you realize, and it's easy to spot, that there is heterogeneity in the distribution of the control groups between different experiments where you have the same control group, it suggests that there is experimental variability in this paper that shouldn't be there. It tells you about the quality of the research was conducted with. So all these things. So I'm not saying you should be overlooking anything. I'm just saying there are different ways to apprehend it, but often it's better to get a feel for the big picture, have your own interpretation of the data, and then you delve into the paper, having made up your mind as to what the data show. Because if you make up your mind before, or at least that's my own personal experience, I'm not saying this is the way you should be doing it. If there's a discrepancy between your interpretation and that of the authors, it flags up things to me.
Okay, thank you, David. It really makes sense.
And one of the purposes of this academy is that along the way, during these 5 reviews, you've kindly volunteered to carry out with us. You will be exposed to the reviews of the other reviewers for these papers, and the editors at one point along the way, it may be the second, it may be the very last one, will discuss with you the extent to which, see all the points you've raised, there is that much similarity with the points raised by the other reviewers. You may not have been critical enough with regards to, I don't know, the style or specific aspects, because you never raised these kind of points that were raised systematically by the other reviewers. So we will help you hone these skills. Okay, you need feedback in order to improve your skills. And that is one of the objectives of this academy.
Oh, that's very good. Thanks, David.
So I just see. So someone said in the chat, Alex, I like to spend an hour or two reading the paper and making notes on it as I read through it. Then I like to take a few days for space from the paper and come back to it with fresh eyes to write up the review. That is a very good way to do it too, absolutely. Once again, I do not mean by sharing my own strategies that this is the only strategy and the one that everyone should be adopting. Alex suggests to do something that we do here with grants. When I write my grants, I would write them and I would not look at them for a week. And I would come back to them with fresh eyes. And then I would send them to friends who would give me feedback. So, it does make sense. Just one recommendation. Think of the work you would be doing in 2 hours plus the time it would take you to write the review. In that case, Alex, I may be wrong, but I would suggest, I believe, 2 hours to read it. Then you come back and you write the review. That could be 2 more hours. That's 4 hours. I would say this is the maximum time you want to spend on the paper. Because then you will have to deal with an issue, which is conflict between investing your time in the preview process and meeting deadlines, producing data you need to do in your lab. So which is something that I would suggest you should try to avoid. But that's a very good strategy indeed. So coming back to how should we write a constructive review then? So we've discussed how we should read the paper. How do we interact with the manuscript? So as we've just said, we should make sure that we have the expertise to assess each aspect of the manuscript. And if you don't, it's absolutely fine. No one will blame you for not having the expertise throughout. You just disclose it to the editor. And there's nothing wrong in your actually review that you submit to say, my expertise lies there, and I can't necessarily speak to this aspect of the manuscript. So that even the authors know that you are an expert there, but you can't do that. So that's something you should be upfront about. Then, as we've discussed, irrespective of the way you gather your comments, you should always make sure that all the points you consider to be crucial in supporting your recommendation to the editor, which is minor revision, major revision, or rejection if it is the case, then they are all there. And often minor revision would be, well, I could not identify a single flaw in there. There may have been a couple of sentences in there that were not clear. And I would encourage the authors to, perhaps we make a revision of these sentences, and that's it. I've had the pleasure several times to just say, good job, congratulations to the authors. I read it thoroughly. I used to make long reviews, and here I have no major criticisms to make. What's tricky is if the editor doesn't know you they may think that you didn't pay enough attention to the paper if you don't find problems. So once again here, communication is key. If there aren't problems, we should not be finding problems. We just should be stating that there aren't any problems and justify why we say there aren't any problems. Does it make sense? So if you think the paper is good as it is, that's it. We do not have to suggest minor revision or major revision. We could also suggest accept as it is if we do think it should be accepted. But we just need to make sure that the editor knows us well enough. So we need communication to justify why we just say accept. What I find difficult, and you may have experienced that yourself, is if a reviewer says, oh, that's great, accept, that reviewer will have less credit than one who says, oh, that's very bad. You know, the first one could be your friend, and the other one has to be objective or could be someone who actually wants to block your work. So to be critical sometimes, just say, yeah, that's fine. The way you write your points is quite important as well. Sometimes it's better to not criticize the authors for issues with the manuscript. So I like to inquire about the points, such as what do the authors think about that particular aspect? And I would say in the methods, there seems to be, lack of clarity about this and that. So I would criticize the manuscript and I would discuss with the authors. But I would not say the authors are wrong or the authors made a mistake. Because why would you do that? It's easier, it's more constructive to say there may be something wrong with the science and ask the authors to better justify this or to tell me what they think about that. So we can raise issues with the science and engage with the authors with inquiries. And I think it's the more neutral and constructive way to write the review. So you refer to the science and not the authors, such that they don't feel judged. And as we've discussed, you engage with the authors about potential solutions with regards to the caveats or the problems you've identified. To some extent, and that is the discussion we've had, to what extent should a reviewer intellectually contribute equally to the authors for the paper to be publishable, right? So that's the discussion we've had. And coming back to your point, Junhan, it's just the point to check, is the manuscript scholarly written? As a matter of fact, the young generation, when I say that, I always feel old, but anyway, the new generations tend to publish new things with fancy techniques as if the world had not existed before fiber photometry and optogenetics. And I see every week papers in Nature and Science when there are big discoveries that we've known for 60 years. So it's very important as a reviewer to remind the authors that they haven't discovered anything. They've just redemonstrated something with a better temporal scale, a better spatial resolution, whatever you want, but the discovery is not there. It's been there for a very long time. So at Brain Communications, it doesn't matter. In many journals, it doesn't matter because novelty should not be important there, but it's not because it's not novel that the authors should actually ignore the fact that it's not novel. Does it make sense? So we are there also to make sure, to guarantee that the background and the context within which the hypothesis is framed and the results are presented is accurate. I can give you an example. We did not need pathway-specific projections and optogenetic manipulations to know that the amygdala was important for appetitive conditioning. 2 Natures in papers in the past 6 years. Well, we've known that since 1989. And in these papers, the reference to the original paper is missing. I have personal problems with that. So it's our job to just make sure that at least the context is right. And often this is overlooked by reviewers because reviewers focus on the data. And then is the experimental and associated statistical design the most appropriate to address the question? There could be another equally appropriate design to address the question. If it's equally appropriate, we've got nothing to say. If there's a real problem, if one technique has been used that cannot provide the kind of data that are necessary to support the conclusions or to address the question, then there's a problem. If there are 12 groups in this study and actually a t-test has been used, there's a problem. This is where we should be looking for problems. Are the methods free of caveats or hidden pitfalls? Do the data reflect research well conducted or not? So this is what we've discussed. If a control group has been used several times, a vehicle group, for instance, and the baseline of that group changes more than 20%, or depending on the field, 5% between experiments, then it tells you that there's a huge variability in the way research has been conducted. I never feel quite comfortable with that. Are the results solid and support the conclusions? And if that is the case, if actually when you read the paper, you tick all these boxes, it's accept. If the results are solid and not support the conclusions, why is it they don't? Is it that actually the results support a different conclusion and there's nothing else to do to that paper, just suggest to the authors, well, actually, you may have shown this and not that for these reasons, or if clearly the results point toward that conclusion and there is a very important group that is missing, not an additional experiment you would have seen done, but a very important group that is missing, then the results do not support the conclusions. But we have to make sure, as a reviewer, not to ask the authors to do experiments we would have done had we carried out that experiment ourselves. That is not what we're here for. We are here to make sure that the conclusions are supported by the data come from well-conducted research, and that the experimental design within which that research is conducted is the most appropriate to address the question. That's it. That's what we're here for. And the scholarly nature of the writing. My personal view is then we give recommendation to the editor. And it is not my job to decide whether this paper has to be accepted or not. It is theirs. And as such, I review the same way, the exact same way, for break communications as I would do for Journal of Neuroscience or Science. The impact factor of the journal for which I review has nothing to do with the way I review. Because the novelty nature of the paper, this lies with the editor. I am here to address the science as a reviewer. What do you think? You may well completely disagree with me. A lot of people, when I say I review the same way for science as I do for general science, they're horrified. Junhua, I think you're speaking, but you're still muted. Do you want me to unmute you?
Hello, David.
Hi.
Yeah.
Did you want to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes I just think I really don't know how can I just look at, I mean, what's the degree I should achieve to just reply, get back to the editors?
So say it again, to what degree?
Because sometimes I really don't know about that career, about that paper. So I only know part of it, I think.
Oh, so when you're sent a paper that you feel not comfortable reviewing because it's too far off your expertise?
Yeah. I mean, only part of that.
Well, in that case, just write to the editors, and when you decline to review, there's always often a link as to why is it you decline to review, and are there any alternative reviewers you would suggest. I would encourage you to always try to help the editors with this, so providing alternative names. But you can also, before you decline, write back to the editor and say, well, thank you very much, but I think I may not fit the bill. I may not be the right person to do that because of this and this and that. And what do you think? Once again, it's a conversation. And I don't know about you guys, those of you who've had that experience. I find very satisfying to write response to reviewers. Sometimes because some reviewers have points that are intellectually engaging, and it's nice to better frame your arguments. Sometimes because clearly they were intentioned, and then you can intellectually engage with them and in the most neutral way explain the extent to which their points are not that don't necessarily make sense. I find it a very, very nice intellectual engagement exercise. As a reviewer, I take great pleasure putting myself in the shoes of others, even though it's complicated. So there's a lot of personal reward to be gained from reviewing. And it's nice to see the paper published. And you're just like, well, to some extent, it's published. And if you really were constructive in your review, there's a bit of you in it. A little bit, but there's a little bit of you. So it's nice. And this is how you realize you can help shape a field. Does it make sense? Most of you haven't said a thing, so I don't know, it's because you're bored and you've been bored since the second minute of this workshop, or if it was all known already to you, and I guess it may well have been the case. I've tried to make some statements that should have resulted in some eyebrows raising, and I didn't see these many. Was that a helpful session? Do you we've got time, so do you have any questions? Do you want do you want to make any comments? Have I wasted your time?
Hi David, I haven't talked in the whole session. No, it was very useful. I think that for me, one of the most enriching discussions have been to discuss how much a reviewer should be an author is something that I guess that I never thought about. So it's not like I have of course, it's the first time that was raised to me. So I guess that leaves me room for thought about how much time you should spend reviewing and getting involved into someone else's work, and when to draw the limit to advice or rejection. So yeah, everything has been very useful. Yeah.
Thank you. Ginny.
Yeah, sorry, I wanted to go back to this sentence that you said where you were like, people are possibly horrified that you review the same way for a high impact journal compared to a low impact journal. And my very naive question is why?
Because it is changing now in the US, but it remains very much the case in many countries in Europe. If you have a paper in science and you have 3 papers in Journal of Neuroscience, you don't have the same prospect for a career. And having myself, so if I told you that I have a couple of publications in science, these papers would have never survived the scrutiny of Journal of Neuroscience. They were novel, expected by the field, and I just happened to have done the experiments at the right time. And I've had recently 2 papers published somewhere else that I submitted to Science because they were very novel. For instance, imagine the idea that in drug addiction, the problem is not the drug. Imagine someone showing the psychological mechanisms and the neural basis of that, and you end up with someone in the field who say that you're mad. That's the review we had. Or other very novel concepts, data that completely changed the field, and we were saying, my lab works with rats. They said, oh, there's not a single issue with this experiment, except the data are not backed up by a full epidemiological study in humans. That's the kind of review I get from science. And then straight rejection, of course. Well, a lot of people consider that these journals, you must ask for 25 years worth of experiments. And the rule is, everything the reviewers ask, you do. Well, I fully disagree with such an approach. So I just review papers there for what they are. Unfortunately, often I would find myself highlighting that the reviewers should look at publications that happen to have been presented before 2000. And that they realize that their science paper with their big discovery, we've known that for 50 years. So what I expect to find in Science and Nature is something new, not a replication of something I've known with a new technique. That's not new. So that's my own personal opinion. So as a reviewer, my job is not to decide if the paper is accepted for publication or not. That is that of the editor. So I review the science. And I submit. I do the same thing for all the journals. Also because I respect my peers. So should we be condescendent with colleagues of ours who submit their work to Journal of No Sense and not big journals? No, I respect my field, I respect my peers, and I treat them all the same way, irrespective of where they publish. Where you get your paper published says nothing about the quality of your paper. I'd rather, I'd have more respect for a paper published in Psychopharmacology or Brain Communications attracting 1,000 citations in 5 years than a paper in Science in the exact same field attracting 20. Right? So yes, I review the same way, irrespective of the IF of the journal, because the IF determines the editorial policy, not the way we should run the evaluation of science. But that's my opinion. I'm fully aware that this is being recorded and that will be on YouTube, so I'm putting myself in difficult situation there. But that's how I think. Is that helpful, Shinichi? Yeah.
Yes, it is. Sorry.
Helena, you want to say something? Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for a really interesting session. I think you raised some really interesting points. And I agree, in the couple of times that I have already given reviewers comments on papers, I try and imagine that I'm actually speaking to the PhD student or the postdoc who's first author to be more empathetic. So yeah, I definitely agree with what you said. I just had a quick question, kind of a minor point. Would you ever comment on the grammar of a paper rather than the science?
Yes, and to be honest with you, as editor, once again, I'm not sure it's happened at BrainComs, but another journal of which I am senior editor, I have several times issued a straight rejection of the paper, inviting the authors to resubmit, provided the language was of a quality sufficient that we could understand. It's happened more than once. And you may think it is ethically questionable. Well, actually, it's not, because if you struggle to understand what's being said, you cannot give due diligence to the science. And I think it is helping the authors to just say, well, right now, there's so much room for misunderstanding in your document that it would not serve you. So yeah, straight rejection, invitation to resubmit once it's been carefully checked. And I would also make, of course, comments on the form as much as the content, when issues with the form can actually impinge on the understanding of the science. So as long as it's okay, and the grammar issues or the command over the English language is sufficient, that the narrative comes across well to support the science, I would leave it to the editorial team to deal with that. But if there are issues with that, of course, I would make comments, and I would actually say, well, that sentence, I'm not sure whether I understand what the authors meant, because what they meant may have been something, but the way it's written is, illogical. So I would, when there's a mismatch between the vehicle of the science and the science itself, I would rate it, of course. And I think, once again, it's part of respecting our peers. And there's nothing condescending about, you can perfectly hear and you've understood, I'm not a native English speaker. My command over English is far from being perfect. And I'm glad when colleagues highlight issues there. And because, again, we engage with the conversation in a conversation with peers, the first respect is about, being authentic and honest. And if the English is not good enough, we have to be honest about it. Unless any one of you disagrees. Once again, I'm giving you a very personal opinion, and I only hope that Tara, our editor-in-chief, has not been horrified by anything I've said, which were many personal opinions. So I may have one day to post something saying, but that was my own opinion and not that of Brain Communications. Any other questions or comments? No? Well, in that case, I would like to thank you very much for your time today and for staying with us until the end. I myself had a good time, and I thank you very much for the questions and the comments you've made. I wish you to enjoy these 5 reviews, at least the first 5. I hope there will be many more. You'll be doing alongside the editors for BrainComs, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you to the Academy. And as you know, I think it's also important to have the perspective of shadowing editors and get a better feel for what that world is from the other side. And I hope I'll have the opportunity to work alongside some of you in the near future. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, thanks.